Request you to please come on stage. I request our first speaker, Prasanta Dhar, PhD candidate, University of Toronto, to please come on stage. Our second speaker, Edoardo Schinco, PhD student, University of Insubria, Italy. Please come on stage. Professor Ish Mishra, Associate Professor, Hindu College. Please join us on stage. And our fourth speaker, Auritro Majumder, Assistant Professor, University of Houston. Could you please take your seat on stage? Kipton Jensen is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. The focus of his research has been on the African-American tradition of nonviolence resistance, especially on Thurman and Martin Luther King. Professor, I request you to take over the proceedings.
Good afternoon. I hope you were able to get some black tea and that you're awake and that you can pay careful attention for the next 2.5 hours. I think our plan is that each speaker, and we'll run in the order as listed in the program serially, that each speaker will have 30 moments. We'll hold our questions until the end and then we'll open it up for discussion. Is that okay? Good. So, okay. Our first speaker, and the topic of the paper is the United Front of Reading Marx, Calcutta, 1930 to 1940, is Mr. Prasanta Dhar.
Thank you. I want to speak here. Hello, good afternoon. Hi. Could I? Then I'll have to switch the computer to. Thank you. Could you hear me now, sir? Thank you. I am Prasanta Dhar from University of Toronto. My thanks and best regards to ADRI and sincere thanks to the organizer, the attendees and my co-panelists. What I will present today is a part of my dissertation research, which presents a methodological argument to global intellectual history. It argues that ideas circulate through association. And I call these associations as infrastructure of mediation and circulation. A discourse, I argue in my dissertation, cannot be disassociated from its circulatory infrastructure, which I call associations. And through an examination of the global circulation of Marxism through Calcutta, my dissertation shows how that circulation began, transformed, and perished in tandem with the generation, the reconfiguration, and the obsolescence of local associations. Today I will present part of my research pertaining to the global circulation of Marxism through associations of the United Front extant in Kolkata in the 1930s, 40s. I'll start with a brief word on my larger project, just briefly, and then go into the specific topic for today. So, to clarify the terms, first of all, Marxism. It's a theory of practice as I take it, an ideology, it's a political credo, it's not the philosophy of Marx. And this is, I am arguing in line with Etienne Balibar and other philosophers. This Marxism the theory of practice, it circulated between the 1880s and 1980s, which Erich Hobsbawm calls the century of Marxism. The circulation was initially confined to Western Europe. It became global only after the Russian Revolution. So the circulation of Marxism was global between the 1920s and 1970s. Importantly, most of Marx's own writings were not published until the 1930s, and they were mostly published by the mid-1970s, by which time the global circulation has ended. So that's a curious relationship between Marx's own writing and Marxism as a theory of practice. The key for my project is circulation, the global circulation of Marxism. So it's an investigation into the ways in which ideas circulate. My argument is that ideas circulate through associations. Now, associations are primarily understood as a group of people organized for a joint purpose. For example, the Progressive Writers Association that was in Europe and in India too. Now, this idea of the associations as purposive collective helps us to focus on the inter-individual territory, other than focusing on individual author and individual writer, the focus on inter-individual territory, which is the space of mediation and circulation. Given that concept of inter-individual territory, a second definition of association as ideological or social link between people is important. And this is where the infrastructure idea comes from. Suppose the Marxists within the UFA, they were not a formal group, they were not a formal association, and when we study Progressive Writers Association as an association, these ideological groups, they get hidden. So these ideological associations I call infrastructure because they get hidden, like the cables that support the internet, but they are hidden under the sea. A third meaning of association as cognitive linking between ideas. That's part of my larger project, but beyond the scope of today's discussion. Thus, let us get to the topic for today, which is the united front of reading Marx. The circulation of Marxism became global after the Russian Revolution when Marxism was presented as a critique of imperialism, and that was the reason why Marxism circulated. Marxism, as a critique of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, attracted the activists from the colonies. Emin Roy was one of them. Ho Chi Minh was another. They came together to build the Communist International and then started the global circulation of Marxism. But there was no one Marxism to start with. Even in the decades before the Comintern, there was no one thing as Marxism. The socialists held up the capital. The communists held up the manifesto. Gramsci, for example, had described the Russian Revolution as a revolution against the capital. So that tussle was there to start with. And even last year, in 2017, the celebration of 100th year of Russian Revolution, also 150th year of the capital, the celebrations we have seen mostly tended to keep away from each other. So the tussle has not ended yet. And some examples we have seen today too. The questions were rather more complicated in 1930s, 40s, because, at least partially because of this curious history of Marx publishing. Most of Marx's own writings were not published in Marx's lifetime. The first systematic publication of Marx's works, the project MEGA1, Mega-1, started under the auspices of Marx Engels Institute in Moscow in 1921. Publishing actually started in the 1930s, and English translations were not available till the 1940s, And even when they were available, they were not available easily in India because of colonial proscription. So the situation was quite complicated in Kolkata. In this context, we got Marxist ideas like historic materialism, not historical, but historic materialism circulating through Kolkata, and this is M.N. Roy's India in Transition, published in 1922. So the global circulation of Marxism through Kolkata began as early as in the 1920s, but mass mediation of Marxism required something more than just publishing. It required a new structure of mass mediation, which was possible only in the mid-1930s with the associations of the United Front. By then, the global circulation was divided between the orthodoxy of the Comintern and the various critics thereof. Consequently, there was a polyphony in the United Front associations on Marxism. This polyphony continued through the entire period of the United Front, which ended in the late 1940s. This is the story I am telling you today. Previous scholarship on United Front have highlighted the circulation of Marxism. For example, Sudhi Pradhan's multi-volume anthology claimed the UFAs as the Marxist cultural movement in India. But scholars have never differentiated between the various strands of Marxism running through the UFAs. What I present here, the UFAs as a motley of ideological groups, which I call infrastructure of mediation. Infra, because they remain covered. In the UFAs, the group adhering to the orthodoxy of the Comintern called themselves the Marxists. And the critics of that orthodoxy identified themselves as Marxians. Then within the Marxians, there were those on the left, or pro-Marxists or philo-Marxists, but also those on the right, the anti-Marxists. In this way, Marxism of the UFA was a polyphony of various ideological orientations. These ideological groups made the boundaries of the UFA permeable. Secondly, the ideological groups also created internal borders within the UFAs. And this idea of internal borders comes from Balibar, actually Fichte through Balibar, or Fichte through Balibar. So these internal borders within the UFAs between the Marxists and the left Marxians. When we examine the UFAs in terms of ideological infrastructure, we can see that, first of all, there was a split between the Marxists and the Marxians. And then the Marxians were further split, and the left Marxians supported the Marxists as they privileged socialism over democracy. The right Marxians privileged ideals of liberal democracy and free market over socialism and critiqued not only Marxism, but also the basic principles of socialism, such as class analysis. And finally, there were interferences and overlaps between the Marxists and the Marxian associations within the UFA. To get to the UFAs then, let us start with the story of the split between the Marxists and the Marxians. That happened before the UFAs. That split was an effect of polarization within the Comintern. In 1927, the Comintern took a right turn by which it expelled Trotsky and others on the left. Next year, the Comintern took a left turn by which it expelled M.N. Roy, Nikolai Bukharin, and others for joining the internal communist opposition right. I mean, this is a historical category. These people called themselves internal communist opposition on the right. This is not just a conceptual category. In consequence, global Marxism was divided between the Marxism of the Comintern and the Marxian way of the opposition. Soon after, dialectical materialism, or diamat, became the credo with Stalin's decree of 1931. Ex-communists like M.N. Roy identified themselves with the Marxian way, on the right. That was the ideological opposition from the right. But the Marxians on the left also opposed Stalin's dogma, especially dialectical critique, dialectical materialism. Left Marxians of Kolkata, like the historian Shoshobhan Sarkar, who were with the CPI, the Communist Party of India, all his life, never a card-bearing member, but all his life affiliated with them, were critical of Stalinist dogma on the one hand, and the right Marxians' revisionism on the other. Both the right and the left presumed the Comintern at the center. So the right and left, what I'm describing here is not the political right of India at that point of time. This is not Chakravarti Rajagopalachari. I mean, there is overlap, but this is not that. It's right of the Comintern and left of the Comintern. So Roy was on the right of the Comintern, but within the penumbra of the Comintern. He never defied Comintern as long as it was alive, till 1943. The circulation of Marx's works became a field of contest between the Marxists and the Marxians. David Ryazanov was the founder of the Marx Engels Institute, the MEI, was exiled himself in 1932, then started the publications of MEI. MEI still remained the center of Marx publishing, headed by left Marxians like Georgi Lukács. The first major publication, German Ideology, came in 1932 in German language, English translation in 1938 from London. Then Moscow, London, and New York constituted the Great Triangle of Marx publishing, while readers' associations like the Left Book Club of London, Critics Group of New York, Socialist Book Club of Allahabad participated in the global circulation. In India, this was the moment of the emergence of the Communist Party of India as a force distinguishable from the Congress organization. So the colonial government responded by framing a series of charges of sedition. For them, the anti-colonial nationalists are still okay. We can dine with them, we can have parties, but communists are, oh no, no, no. So the government responded by framing these charges of sedition, most notably the Mishra conspiracy case of 1928-29. When in jail, the communists launched the first collective reading of Marxism. Now here we find an irony. The same government that routinely proscribed communist literature had to supply books to the communists in jail. Shripad Amrit Dange, one of the accused, tells us this story. I quote, "The government put into evidence hundreds of books about Russia and Russian Revolution. This gave us the opportunity to ask for more books which we had never heard or seen, as they had been confiscated in the customs under government orders. So under the special order of the court, they were brought from England and given us to read in jail." So Dange also gives us a list of 23 classics of Marxism. I have abbreviated them according to their author. You can see there was very little Marx there. Very little of Marx. The socialists and the liberals in India also read Marxism with gusto. Nehru visited the Comintern in 1927, then wrote a book in 1933 with 2 chapters on Karl Marx. And then even the apolitical Rabindranath Tagore visited Russia in 1930 and wrote the famous Letters from Russia, a critical celebration of existing socialism. Then the literary journal Porichoy was launched next year, 1931. It started with a serial on Russian history by the historian Shoshobhan Sarkar. Then newspapers like Langul, Ganobani, Shanghati, etc., they published articles on Lenin's biography, on October Revolution, on the importance of organizing the peasants and workers, and so on. Then there were also translations of writings of Maxim Gorky without little consciences on their value. Thus, till the mid-1930s, there were differences and commonalities among the liberal, socialists, and the communists as to what constituted Marxism and what was its relationship with the writings of Karl Marx. Then came the United Front associations. In 1935, the Comintern published a thesis on the necessity of an anti-fascist popular movement. The thesis defined fascism as, I quote, the open terrorist dictatorship of finance capital. There are words beaten. What then was the role of culture in fascism? The thesis didn't have any answer. In fact, the thesis expressed astonishment on the popularity of fascism among the working class, especially in Europe. That economistic analysis of the Comintern was rudimentary, all right? It's, in fact, reductionist, but it was important for organizing people's front. There lies the efficacy of Comintern thesis. In the same year, a group of French intellectuals organized International Writers' Congress for the Defense of Culture. Their stress on culture was remarkable, especially in contrast with the economism of the Comintern thesis. The question of culture was important for the Indian students in Britain, and these are Mulk Raj Anand, Sajjad Jahir, Hirendranath Mukhopadhyay, et al., most of whom were close to the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, not so very far from the class analysis of Comintern, still focusing and enhancing their critique based on the idea of culture. They established the Progressive Writers Association in London and shifted it to India in 1936, thus began the cultural associations of the United Front. Now, this was happening in a historical conjuncture. Pursuant to the Government of India Act of 1935, provincial elections were to be held in 1937. So when the PWA inaugurated in 1936 in Lucknow, Nehru also delivered his lecture on socialism in the same city at the same time, although from a different platform. This is to say that the UFAs were thoroughly politicized cultural associations. They were a civil society in the Gramscian sense, civil because of their investment in politics. And this is my vision of the UFAs, which is a little bit away from what some later Gramscians have called not state, therefore civil. Civil society is not state, therefore civil. Well, the UFAs were civil, therefore statist, not the state per se. Marx reading in the PWA was preoccupied with Marx's 1853 articles. British rule in India and future of British rule in India. The Calcutta PWA began, it published its collection, Pragati. It's otherwise a directionless motley of literary works which did not but failed to add British rule in India, translated into Bengali but by Hirendranath Mukherjee. The London-trained Indians generally argued that Marx had shown that although British rule had destroyed India economically, socially, and culturally, that bursting asunder, and this is a quote from Marx's article, the bursting asunder of feudal social structure also had a regenerative role in bringing about a social revolution in Asia. So that was the Marx of the PWA, the Marx of 1853 articles. In about the same time, Nehru wrote his chapters on Marx in early 1930s. Mulk Raj Anand had compiled an anthology titled Marx and Engels on India. Then the proof was mislaid by the publishers in London, and this is Lawrence and Wishart, I believe. After the election of 1937, however, the English publisher conducted an intensive search and found the galley proof and restored it to the author with permission to publish it from India. So came into being Marx and Engels on India in 1938. It contained, among other things, those two articles of Karl Marx from 1853. Another Indian collection of Marx's writings on India had already been published in India, Anand tells us. And of course, there was this Russian collection by David Razanov of MEI. So that was Marx on India, in India. Now, Anand's book was published by the Socialist Book Club of Allahabad. This is another important aspect of the infrastructure that I described. The list of foundation members included Subhash Chandra Bose, Acharya Narendra Deva, Jayaprakash Narayan, Minu R. Masani, Puranchand Joshi, Ram Manohar Lohia, Mulkraj Anand, and Z.A. Ahmed. Now, in 1933, they subscribed to the Marxian understanding of colonialism as destructive but also regenerative. Within a decade, they were to be found scattered all over the political spectrum, ranging from the far left to the far right, redefining colonialism, nationalism, and Marxism. Because the UFAs were deeply invested in politics, they became dysfunctional when the United Front in politics was abandoned. This happened when the Second World War started and the Viceroy declared India as belligerent without even consulting the people's representative. The Indians felt humiliated and resigned from all provincial governments. The PWA works were stalled, although the writers and artists continued their work. Then the death blow came when the Soviet Union joined the war. The CPI, the principal organizer of the PWA, or the UFAs, although from undercover, abandoned the United Front and took up the People's War line, which argued that liberation in the colonies depended on Allied victory over fascist power. This is so far against the United Front principle. So the United Front crumbled and the PWA became inactive at the All India level. Then the CPI privileged the people's organizations like Indian. What's that? 5 minutes? Yeah. I'll try. Yeah. Thanks. So the UFS continued thereafter at the regional level. Activists in Kolkata formed the Friends of Soviet Union, League Against Fascism and War, etc. Then the Anti-Fascist Writers and Artists Association was formed in 1942, and it decided to work as the Bengal branch of the PWA. So this is a story of decentralization, not the decay of the UFAs. In 1945, after the fascist empires were conclusively defeated, the FWAA was renamed as the Progressive Writers and Artists Association, PWAA. And it carried the circulation of Marxism, especially the idea of socialist realism. Then we get the first Bengali journal of theoretical Marxism, named the Marxist, alive between 1948 and 49. So this part of the narrative we gather from the available literature on the UFA. What we need to understand is, well, what I'm going to present now. Here lies the efficacy of studying associations as infrastructure of mediation. Previous scholarship on the UFA has left out the story of the anti-Marxists. They included Marxians like Emin Roy, but mostly right liberal anti-Marxist intellectuals. Roy himself remained outside the UFA, but he never joined the political right. But some of the associates did join the UFA, and some of them did go so far on the right as to accept funding from the CIA. Abu Sayyid Ayub, a professional philosopher and of idealist orientation, was one of the most important interlocutor of Roy. In the 1950s, he edited a literary journal that was funded by the CIA indirectly. When the scandal became public in 1967, most of the beneficiaries shut off, but Ayub kept defending his action on the basis of quality of his work. The other prominent associate was the poet Sudhindranath Datta, who founded the journal Porichoy in 1931, but lost the journal to the communists. So these colleagues, these associates, and there is a list of names here. I'm not going into the details for the sake of time. They ran the journal called The Marxian Way in Calcutta between 1945 and 1949. They also ran Indian Renaissance Institute located in Shamla but operated mostly from Kolkata. Their motto was radical humanism, what Roy envisioned as the forebearer of cultural renaissance in contemporary India. By then, however, by 1949, Roy has stopped talking about class analysis and of Marx. After coming of the People's Republic of China, Roy changed the name of his journal to The Humanist Way, no more Marxian Way. So the Marxists also forgot that only a couple of decades ago, this Emin Roy was the Comintern emissary to China. Now, Roy's associates in Calcutta were never registered society as the Royists. So the debates between the Royists and the Marxists are never recorded at as the level of association, in the sense of registered society. So, for example, Dhananjay Dasher Marxbadi Sahitya Bitorko does discuss the contributions of Royists, Ayub, Kabir, Dotto, but never mentions them as an associations. The Royists in Kolkata are unregistered socialities, gathered around the Marxian Way, around Dotto's Adda, and so on and so forth. These otherwise hidden part of the narratives come to the fore once we look at the UFAs as infrastructure of mediation, as collection of ideological groups. We have seen how Royists live inside and outside of the UFA, making the boundaries of the UFAs more permeable and than is usually recognized. The other aspect, the border within the UFA was drawn between the Marxists and the left Marxians. For example, the debate on Bengal Renaissance, on which we are not going today, but what we get from the existing literature is a story that Marxist historian wrote a pamphlet in 1946, this is Sushobhan Sarkar, entitled Notes on Bengal Renaissance. Then another Marxist blasted that trope and so on and so forth. But there is no mention of Roy's works on Indian Renaissance. Without that story, how could he historicize this story? So I therefore argue here and in my larger project that a study of associations as infrastructure of mediation can recover these otherwise subjugated stories in the global circulation of mediation, global circulation of Marxism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very kindly. From the University of Insubria, Italy, Historical Process and Gender Essentialism from Dialectical Point of View, a contribution to Marxian Feminist Theory. Please welcome Edoardo.
Hello to everyone, and at the very beginning I would like to thank so much Asian Development Research Institute for having organized this great conference and for having me here. But just to go straight to the point, the research paper I present today is entitled Historical Process and Gender Essentialism from a Dialectical Point of View, a contribution to a Marxian feminist theory. There is no room for doubt that Marxism and feminism have had a very controversial relation. On the one side, as we will see later, feminists criticize Marx's theory. But on the other side, however, it is true that Marxist thinker, I'm thinking about, for example, Hegel's famous book on the origin of the family, private property, and the state. Marxist thinker, I was saying, gave to feminists some theoretical tools to address discrimination and submission-related issues. In general, both socialist and Marxist theorists played a central role in feminist debate during the 19th and 20th century because of their criticism against classic liberalism. This fight indirectly helped feminists in defining a new understanding of family, insofar as one of the main goals Marxist analysis of classic liberalism tried to achieve was the denaturalization of the capitalist mode of production. This accusation about the naturalization promoted by liberal thinkers can be already found in the young Marx, especially in the economic and philosophic manuscript of the 1844. There, Karl Marx already attempted to point out how the eternal economic law described by classic economists were rather contingent laws, depend on capitalism itself. In all his work, repeatedly, Marx stressed the fallacious circularity characterizing typical reasoning of economists. That is, they assumed historical features of the capitalist mode of production without providing any explanation about the genesis of them. In this way, those features were understood as universal and fundamental elements of any mode of production. In so doing, they were turned into unchangeable eternal economic laws. Moreover, this move implicitly produced an apology for capitalist system itself. Of course, if capitalism was just a pure expression of economic laws, there was no reason to complain about that, nor was it possible to improve capitalism at all. So, by calling into these dogmas of classic economics into question, Marx rejected the theoretical naturalization of capitalist category brought about by the liberal thinkers. However, unfortunately, Marx did not deeply address issues connected with women's condition within the society. The most important exception were some parts of the Capital and the Manifesto of the Communist Party. On the one side, the Capital extensively described the historical evolution of capitalism, especially in the chapter regarding the working day, that is the chapter 8 in the first edition of Capital. There, Marx talks about the exploitation of women's and children's labor. In so doing, he partly succeeded in underlining the different impact of capitalism on different subjects according to their own age, class, and, what is more important here, sex. But on the other side, the manifesto sporadically focused its attention on women's condition. Nonetheless, it was enough, these attempts, they were enough to outline an informal Marxian theory of family as social institution. For example, Marx drew a significant parallel between the subordination in the workplace and the subordination within the household. As the workers were submitted to capitalists' arbitrary will, so the wife was submitted to husband's arbitrary will in the household. In this sense, Marx tried to underline that the family had to be understood as a part of the society as a whole. He just sketched this connection. Anyway, the suggestions in this regard he gave are still useful to understand what a consistent Marxian position about family looked like. Roughly speaking, it seemed that contact points between family and mode of production are substantially true. At first, the mode of production defined the external form of the family. To put it differently, the mode of production plays a central role in determining what family means and hence who legitimately belongs to the family. And as we know, the composition of family changes over time. And for instance, the contemporary nuclear family has not so much in common with the ancient Roman family. Furthermore, the position of family within the social totality changed over time as well. And we can have evidence of that if we compare, for example, Aristotle's politics and Aristotle's suggestion about family with a Hobbesian or in general a contractarian point of view. In addition, secondarily, the mode of production also defines the internal structure of the family. It shapes, in a certain way, the kind of relation existing among individuals within the household. The absolute power of, for example, of the paterfamilias in the ancient Roman family was replaced in the modern age by a different relationship in the bourgeois family. Clear here as elsewhere, feature of family institution can be separately analyzed from the social context only in an abstract way. Actually, society and family are strictly intertwined, and they condition each other by virtue of the dialectic relation. So, at this point, we think that it's a possible feminist use of Marxian framework start to loom quite clearly. Indeed, Marx criticism against the naturalization of classic economics dogmas could be easily transferred in other social domains. Thus, following this path, feminists call into question the illusory eternity of traditional family structure and traditional family ties. The family natural institution was turned by feminists into a social construction changing over time. So at this time, between the 19th and the 20th century, feminists still accepted the existence of the two sexes, men and women, but they partially restricted the normative value of sex itself. They denied the possibility to univocally deduce a specific form of family, that is the natural family, by simply analyzing the inter-essence of the two sexes. On the contrary, they took account of a set of natural relations between men and women, but at the same time, they stressed the historical evolution of family, that is, the social, what we could call the social shell surrounding and shaping relation between the two sexes. Moreover, and this is the second point we will address, moreover, according to a new understanding of equality, feminists employed Marxist and socialist theory in order to criticize the concept of formal equality. This liberal equality, indeed, was a mere equality of opportunity, as we know, deriving from individuals' negative rights. And for example, first wave feminists use it to get rid of some previous criticism of conservative people. Unlike this liberal position, feminists reframe the concepts of equality in order to take one sex into account. The category of sexual difference became central within this framework, and feminist efforts reversed the discriminatory use of sex by employing that category to develop a broader concept of justice. So, they, feminists, did not deny the set of biological difference naturally distinguishing men from women. Still, they denied the relevance of these differences with regard to any legal and political discourses. They neutralized conservative people's strategy by preventing them from taking sexual difference into account. This is the liberal position against conservative people. Notwithstanding that, the insufficiency of formal equality led feminists to reframe once again and improve their concept of equality later. As conservative people, these new feminists put at the heart of their reasoning the idea of sexual difference, but they stressed those biological differences only to show how the abstract formal equality could not provide an appropriate protection for people situated in a different position within the society. Then we have now to talk about the limits of the contribution of Marx to feminists. So, is it true that we can say that it is true that feminists and Marxists moved at the same place for some decades? especially because, as we said before, the radicalism of Marx theory and its crucial idea to drastically transform the contemporary capitalist society in order to get rid of all its essential inequalities strengthened this temporary alliance. Furthermore, is it true that, as an historical example, the set of policies enacted by Soviet government in matter of equality between men and women marked an important step toward a gender fair equality. That is, in a few years, Soviet regime legalized abortion and divorce, gave women a broader range of work opportunities, and new labor laws regarding maternity leaves and insurances. Lenin's famous speech on International Women's Day in 1920 summarized quite well strong and weak points of Marxist approach to the women question. Lenin there distinguished two different degrees of equalities between the two sexes. The two sexes. The first goal, according to Lenin, was to achieve a full legal equality, improving bourgeois freedoms. But the second degree was to reform labor market and create appropriate conditions in the workplace, both to boost women's agency and to set them free from domestic slavery. Lenin's discourse made his well-known political foresight clear. This discourse perfectly mirrors what Marx expressed briefly in relation to women's emancipation. For this reason, it was evident the direct connection that Lenin, according to Marx's view, established between full emancipation of women and material condition. As Marxist theory suggests, and Marxian theory suggested, to improve those conditions meant to improve women's general condition. Surely, this assumption has been true for a very long time. Still, in the long run, this peculiar perspective openly showed its inner limits. So, for ensuring that everyone will be on the same page in this regard, let us start by drawing a parallel between the controversial idea of the coming of communist phase within Soviet Russia's overall. So, in his well-known pamphlet, The State and Revolution, Lenin used Marx and Engels' various contributions to shed a light on their official position about the death of the state under communism. Lenin suggested the state would have been employed by the Revolutionary Party in order to facilitate the passage from the capitalist mode of production to the communist one. This transitory phase would have been characterized by a socialist economy whose imperfect economic features, compared to the further communist economy, have been partially described by Marx in his critique of the Gotha program. Lenin's intent aside, history later shows how this interpretation of Marx and Engels' thought was turned into a powerful tool of governance into Stalin's hands. Instead of being a mere transitory moment, the socialist stage of Soviet Russia became eternal and served as an excuse for Stalin to increase the state power and to procrastinate more and more the eschatological final coming of a communist society. To a certain extent, the problematic history of the relation between Marxism and feminism followed the same pattern. In general, Marxist thinkers developed a very interesting framework to address feminist issues, avoiding a shallow theoretical reductionism. They knew that any actual situation is always made up of a wide range of factors. Therefore, they found a way to address all these factors involved, systematizing them in a well-ordered hierarchy. They promptly distinguished between a social main contradiction, Hauptwiderspruch, and a secondary contradiction, Nebenwidersprüche. The former was always essential antagonism between opposite social classes, changing according to the mode of production. Class struggle logical priority was due to the fact that this crucial contradiction shaped all the other social elements and assign them a new role within the social totality. Hence, the latter, that is, all the other social contradictions, were necessarily subordinated to the class struggle. In light of this, the achievement of new rights for female workers became the key word of feminist politics in Western communist countries. The history of German Democratic Republic, DDR, is a brilliant example of this theoretical trend. Their communist government enacted many policies in order to broaden the set of rights and protection for women. In addition, official feminist groups surely played a proactive role and supported government's effort to improve women's social standing. However, government main focus only continued to be on females' worker condition. Government devised many training programs for female workers. Indeed, helping women to become skilled workers was seen as a fundamental step, or even the only way, to pursue women's full emancipation. This approach was perfectly consistent with the official Marxist ideology, since the woman question was understood as a part of the broader social question. Hence, women's interests were perceived as less important than class interests. Once again, communist guidelines on equality between men and women brought about a very significant improvement of women's condition. Still, generally speaking, the implicit price for that was the reduction of one's self-realization to self-realization as worker. At the end, the general framework did not change so much from the above-mentioned Lenin's perspective on women's emancipation. For this reason, when women's rights organizations started to highlight different aspects of the women's question and asked for the deconstruction of other kinds of gender inequality, this old-fashioned Marxist position revealed its inner weak point. Compared to many capitalist Western countries, women's condition in DDR improved fast, but mainly in only one direction. Indeed, communist strategy seemed not to address the whole spectrum of domestic slavery-related issues, insofar as the household remained a female domain. DDR attempts to introduce women in the national workforce did not affect widespread understanding of women's traditional role. Women were not either worker or stay-at-home mothers. Rather, they had to be both worker and mother. The new social position of women as worker did not replace their classic role of mother. Instead, their politics aimed to integrate the alternative dimension of work and motherhood. So, as soon as the international feminist movement grew up and got stronger and stronger, feminist reaction was not so long in coming. In the 60s and the 70s, the 60s and the 70s marked a turning point for feminists all around the world. Feminist thinkers developed more and more an independent point of view by calling into question their alliance with socialist and Marxist groups. Investigating those previously progressive positions, feminist movement denounced their partial failures. Even if socialism and Marxism gave a decisive boost to women's emancipation once, they ended up overshadowing the whole range of women's interests and rights. Furthermore, they fueled a paternalistic approach since they prevent women from thinking about themselves in a completely autonomous way. For example, we can quote some sentence from a famous manifesto of the Italian feminist Carla Lonzi, sputiamo su Hegel, let's spit on Hegel. And she's saying at some point, I wrote Let's Spit on Hegel because I was disappointed in realizing that almost the totality of Italian feminists was more focused on class struggle than on women's own oppression. So this updated version of feminism refused to subsume the woman question under the different concept of the social question. Even if those two questions could not be merely juxtaposed, they could not even just overlap. The provocative claim to spit on Hegel, assumed as the metaphor for the entire Marxist universe, mean to suggest women to think outside the box with regard to their own oppression. By replacing old categories, such as the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, with new ones, it was possible for feminists to shed a significant light on unexplored sides of women's patriarchal oppression. Marxism and socialism aside, thus here also plays a central role in the evolution of Western feminism, since Stinker further expanded the above-mentioned critique of formal equality. Born under the sign of sexual difference, the second wave of feminism ended up drastically criticizing the concept of universalism itself. In this regard, many kinds of influences, theoretical, practical, and historical, converged in feminist thought and brought about this radical shift. Surely, the concept of difference implied the rejection of a certain 20th century version of philosophical universalism. The well-founded suspicion against universalism pushed feminism to look for an alliance with other minorities, once again. The risk of any universalism was its possibility to turn into a power device guaranteeing the hegemony of ruling social group over the subaltern ones. As the failure of human rights rhetoric had shown in the past, the universal subject involved in that kind of universal discourses was surreptitiously defined through hegemonic groups' typical features. For example, the so famous French Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen virtually referred to every human being. Nonetheless, when Olympe de Gouges challenged the male authority with her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, revolutionary regime did not hesitate to condemn and execute her by guillotine. Here, elsewhere, feminists pointed out the danger lurking behind this illusory claim for universal right. In that context, it did not take such a long time for that general and abstract human being to show oneself to be the portrait of the white heterosexual man. Therefore, since Simone de Beauvoir's landmark book, Le Deuxième Sexe, feminist speculation gradually decided to reorient its reflection on the peculiarity of being a woman compared with being a man. Along with this feminist perspective, the more general reflection on cultural hegemony and subaltern non-Western cultures pushed radical thinkers to call into question European cultures' presumed superiority. Marxist-related scholars, such as Franz Fanon, tried to restore the dignity of colonized and marginalized cultures. In particular, the main effort, an effort common to all the minorities, was to fight against the sense of submission and inferiority that submitted people introjected over the centuries. The progressive re-evaluation of subaltern culture against Western hegemonies underlined the philosophical necessity to give minorities the actual opportunity to develop their own alternative point of view. And post-colonial studies work in this direction. So at this point, I kind of realized that my paper is definitely too long for 30 minutes. So I want just to say that I want just to skip at the end. I will have addressed Michel Foucault, and especially Michel Foucault's influence on the third wave of feminism, and in particular on Judith Butler. And the suggestion I would like to give to Marxist thinker today is just to study more and once again Hegel dialectics in order to develop another kind of universalism that is not the whole universalism that, as we have seen, it didn't work so well, because at some point the main group included in the alliance ended up overshadowing the interests of the minorities. So we should think about that once again and try to develop another kind of universalism that is not so much in common with the previous one.
Thank you. Our next paper, Indian Context, a study into the application of the principles of Marxism in the Indian Communist Movement, as presented by a Professor Mishra. Please welcome.
Can I be allowed to present from here? Like, I don't have hard copies, so I have to.
Do you want to open your computer there? can stand there.
Yeah, but the podium is very low. I have to look like that.
Okay. Yeah, we can try. Okay, we can try.
First of all, I must thank to RD people, organizers of this seminar, that when everyone is writing of Marxism, everyone is writing into the history, organizing a 5-day seminar on Marx is a matter of appreciation. This must be really a matter of courage. So, due to inadvertent mistake of the coordinators, who, not knowing my intellectual vagabondism and scholarly indiscipline, allowed me open-ended deadline, and the prelude I had planned to be for 1200 words expanded into 10,000 words. And then I realized that prelude cannot overshadow the text, but it has already been done. At such occasions, on a lighter mood, I am reminded of a admission story of Anjani Kumar. He is probably now secretary to the Bihar Chief Minister. He went to JNU for admission in Center for Regional Development Studies, and it is said Munis Raja asked him in 1978 that, do you think that the geographical location of the Gandhi Setu on Ganga is appropriate? Pawanji said that, now this question is irrelevant. Pul to adha ban chuka hai. The bridge has already been half constructed, so this question doesn't mean anything. So it's just, then this morning, the paper ran into 17,000 words, over 17,000 words. I had to change the topic from Marxism in Indian context to Marxism and Indian context, and prelude I had to change into introduction and part first. I'm not reading out, so I prepared half an hour summary from what I had written. So I'll begin my presentation with a oft quoted quotation from German ideology. This I find one of the key quotations, one of the key statements of Karl Marx. Before that, I just like to comment on Professor Jensen's dichotomy of dialectical materialism and inevitability. I have never found that Marx says that stages are inevitable automatically. Of course, the ruling classes have everything on their disposal, all kinds of power, all kinds of privileges, all kinds of apparatuses. How to fight them? But central message of Marx is that it can be done and it has to be done. Things do not change on their own. The third thesis of thesis on fireworks says that consciousness is product of material conditions, change consciousness is product of change material conditions. Then Marx asked Feuerbach that who changes the material conditions? According to Newton's law of motion, nothing changes on its own. So the stages are not inevitable. Marx writes that in 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte that man makes his own history, but not in the circumstances chosen by himself or the way he wants to make history as he pleases. But he has to make history in the circumstances given and transmitted from the past. the traditions way on the brain of living like the nightmare of the dead generations. So the circumstances are essential. Lenin also in the aftermath of revolution and counter-revolution very clearly says that precondition to revolution is revolutionary circumstance, but revolutionary circumstance in itself is not revolution. I'll just get back to my paper readout. So, the famous quotation from German ideology, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls at the same time the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. I would not read the whole quotation. I will supplement it by Sartre's first sentence of the preface to Frank Fanon's work, Wretched of the Earth. Not so long ago, Earth numbered 200 million people, 500 million men and 1,500 million the natives. The men had the words and natives the use of it. Like the ruling classes have the ideas and ruled classes are subject to it. They do not have any ideas. Their ideas are also subject to the ideas of the ruling classes. I'll just like to give my honor to Karl Marx. I'll just read out a very, very brief life sketch of Karl Marx. This is bicentenary year of Karl Marx and 170th year of the publication of Communist Manifesto, which called the workers of the world to unite to loose their chains of wage slavery and eventually lead to creating a society free from exploitation and domination. That is the end of alienation, to a state what he calls of human emancipation, the nirvana in Buddhist parlance. In fact, the only parallel as a thinker, teacher, and activist in the history to Marx is Buddha of the ancient India in terms of envisioning a society free from miseries and pain. Here there is no scope to digress into Buddhist intellectual revolution and Brahmanical counter-revolution. The purpose of reference to Buddha is to allude to the similarities in terms of scientific comprehension of society and commitment to create a world free from suffering and pain, irrespective of the distant time and space. Like Buddha, Marx too was not only interested in interpreting the world, but also in changing it. 19th century Europe witnessed many revolutions in the realms of social and intellectual movements. The common people who entered the arena of political theory through Rousseau in the 18th century found a profound spokesperson in the genius of Karl Marx in the 19th century as the new protagonist of the history, the proletariat. In that age of invention of knowledge, in the words of Louis Althusser, Marx invented a new continent of knowledge. But the word continent is associated with imperialist colonization. In fact, he invented a new galaxy of knowledge in the form of historical materialism, key to which is economy. His ideas are as relevant to comprehend the dynamics of neoliberal age of capitalism and the ongoing politico-cultural discourse as in his contemporary liberal capitalism, though the capitalism has taken many terms different from his projection. Engels had commented in 1891 that a Marxist is not one who quotes from Marx's or his works, but the one who reacts to a particular circumstance as Marx would have reacted in that circumstance. Marx himself, in delineating the historical epochs based on mode of production, has repeatedly emphasized the uneven development of stages and variation of methods of the development. Rosa Luxemburg, in her celebrated essay on Russian Revolution, after praising the Bolsheviks under the leadership of Lenin for their accomplishment in the peculiar, particular conditions then prevailing in Russia, had cautioned that policies and strategies and principles should not be advanced as universal principles of proletarian revolutions. But most of the parties founded under the auspices of Comintern did not heed her advice, and instead of looking at it as a method, adopted Russian Revolution and Marxism as models. Application of Marxism involves first to grasp the existing contradictions, major, minor, and hostile, non-hostile, and the composition of the existing social forces in accordance to the Marxist principles, that is, the principles of historical materialism. In my long paper, I have dealt with the historical materialism, dialectical materialism, class and party, class and class consciousness, self-criticism, and praxis. Also on the party line, which I think is un-Marxian. I'll very briefly talk about that at the end of the matter. Whatever I have read about Marx and Engels, I find party line as un-Marxian concept. Anyway, application of Marxism involves first to grasp the existing contradictions, major, minor, and hostile, non-hostile, and composition of, and then the related important and, in my opinion, most difficult task is to translate, adopt, and adapt these principles into particular historical context and work out strategies to organize and agitate the oppressed for their emancipation. Among the old generation Indian Marxists, Acharya Narendra Dev made genuine attempts to translate and interpret the principles of Marxism in the Indian context with reference to Buddhism. Marx's critique of capitalist political economy is based on his readings of contemporary capitalism as it was developing in Western Europe, where the bourgeois democratic movement had already abolished the feudal relations of birth qualification, and economy had become the only basis of social division. That is why Marx writes that the modern epoch, the epoch of bourgeoisie, has simplified the contradiction. It has split the society into two hostile camps, bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But in India, for historical reasons, Renaissance kind of social intellectual movement launched by Kabir and carried forward by Bhakti movement with the central theme of social and spiritual equality could not reach its logical conclusion. Also, India did not witness any bourgeois democratic movement mainly as the colonial intervention did not allow the natural growth of capitalism. Till 1813, international trade meant trade into Indian and East Asian goods. I might be corrected if I am wrong. British did not come here to sell their goods. They would come here with the money, with the silver and gold obtained from the slave trade in Caribbean, buy Indian goods and sell it into America and Europe. So, natural growth of capitalism, as in England, as in Europe, it took place. Transition from feudalism to capitalism took place not with the change in the methods of production, but with the change in the relations of the production with the pre-capitalist methods. There is no scope of going into details how brutal and barbaric was the rise and growth of capitalism with the enclosure movement and all that. Marx very well treats it in the 26th chapter of the Capital, volume 1, under the title of so-called primitive accumulation. The failure of Indian communists to fulfill The unaccomplished task of the bourgeois democratic revolution subsequently led to the growth of identity politics in India's present political scenario. The invocation of the caste identity by the section of the forces of social justice is as big speed breaker as the invocation of the religious identity by the communal forces in the radicalization of the social consciousness. Now the paper begins. Marxism in the Indian context. Unlike other political parties, a communist party lays more emphasis on theory, a theoretical system of ideas known as historical materialism. The evolution of theoretical and pragmatic Marxism has gone through immense internal stress, encountered multiple contradictions, and faced various questions, the answers of which it has failed to provide, or it has simply reduced them to black and white categories. In a way, official revolutionaries sought immediate and almost un-Marxian answers to highly complex situations. Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, I just quoted in the beginning. What were the circumstances given and transmitted from the past? As Marx says that men make history in the circumstances transmitted from the past. What were the circumstances given and transmitted from the past in the beginning and the journey of the Indian communist movement? What were the major and minor contradictions? There were and are three major contradictions. Contradiction of colonial rule and Indian people as a whole. In today's neoliberal age of capitalism, colonial exploitation and domination has been replaced by those of imperialist global capital coordinated by international financial institutions like World Bank. Second, between the caste and class. Economic domination combined with the socio-cultural domination and subjugation sanctioned by religion, a sizable section of the people was treated and are being treated untouchables. Now by publicizing on the camera meal at the Dalit's place. Third, contradiction of capitalist and proletariat. That is the class contradiction of bourgeoisie and the proletariat and of landlord and peasants. Many of them overlap. The ruling castes have been the ruling classes also. It is the ruling castes which had economic structure on its dispersal, and hence it was the ruling class also. The ruling castes and ruling classes always have overlapped in India. The Communist Party of India was formed in 1921 by M.N. Roy in Tashkent with Indian immigrants. On invitation of Lenin, Roy wrote, as is well known, an alternative thesis on colonial question. Roy was against joining the movement, and the proletariat on its own will carry out the anti-colonial and proletarian revolutions simultaneously. How non-pragmatic and romantic was Roy's opinion, the political, economic and political strength, that is numerical and the ideological strength of industrial proletariat was negligible. Like Lenin's assessment as compared to Roy was more pragmatic, who considered the national liberation movement as progressive and democratic and advised the communists to participate into it by retaining their identity and weaning away the radical elements from the Congress. From 1920 till 1928, it has always been command communism. Our predecessors, our ideological ancestors did not use Marxism to analyze their own concrete situations, instead of followed Comintern or the line of the CPSU. The 7th Congress of Comintern, so dissociation from the movement led to the loss of credibility by the communist members, which they had built in up to 1928. in 1934, and again, those who talk about the treachery of the Communist Party must know that the Communist Party of India has been the only party which has faced cases of sedition as a party as a whole. No party in India has been, the party as a whole has been charged for attempting to dislodge the British rule. 7th Congress of the Comintern in 1934 resolved in favor of United Front, and as already mentioned, same year was founded the Congress Socialist Party by some young congressmen who claimed Marxism to be their ideological source. The founding document of Congress Socialist Party says that Congress Socialist Party is founded by those congressmen and women who had come under the influence of Marxism as an ideology. Gandhi wrote in his paper that some congressmen and women are indulging into loose talks of class war and all that. Jayaprakash Narayan wrote back, war is already on. The question is of taking side. Anyway, so 1934-42 was the high time for the Indian left. Congress Socialist Party, it is this time when Congress Socialist Party admitted individual communists as members. E.M.S. Namboodiripad was the first joint secretary of the Congress Socialist Party. So it is this time when it got firm footing into students, got student organizations, into peasants and into workers, into trade union movements, 34 to 42, and CSP, including members of CPI, okay, CSP, including the members of CPI, were so strong force that they ensured the victory of Subhash Chandra Bose twice, once in the situation where Gandhi had given the emotional call that defeat of the Subhash Bose's opponent, that is Sitaramaiah, is his own defeat, but Pattabi Sitaramaiah was defeated. And it was neutrality. It was the neutrality of the CSP and the notorious Panth resolution which sought Congress President to take advice of Mahatma Gandhi on every point, and Mahatma Gandhi said that he is not a Congress member. So, neutrality of the Congress Socialist Party had led to the passage of the notorious Panth resolution, which, like that is a history, Subhash Bose left the party and went to join fascist forces to fight the colonialism. Till 1942, again, war is an issue in itself, it cannot be solution to any issue. I would not go into details, it is very well known that till 1942, like any revolutionary, any radical people of the world, Congress Socialist Party, including Communist Party, was going ahead with the anti-war plan. As soon as Hitler attacked Soviet Union, anti-war platform was transformed into pro-war platform, and I don't condemn them. They realized the mistake and self-criticized, but that was a situation. When you are reading history, it is a different thing. When you are making history, it is altogether a different thing. Like, that was a situation when anyone would be in dilemma. The Japanese forces had already reached up to Assam, and fighting a bourgeois constitutional colonialism is easier than fighting a fascist bourgeois colonialism. But still, CPI's support would not have made any difference to the world war. They should have analyzed their conditions here and taken the decision on the immediate issue, because the immediate contradiction was the contradiction with the colonialism. Though it was a mistake, but it cannot be considered, it cannot be condemned or treated as a treachery. It was a mistake. It was a difficult decision that time to take. So, in the emotional milieu of the nationalism, their war platform also took a toll on their things. Still, so I'll just conclude in, I think there would be 5 minutes, that not only in one of the major contradictions was the contradiction of the casteism. The birth qualification, which was abolished in Europe, still persists here. Communist Party of India, had it taken the issue of the social justice on its agenda, maybe Ambedkar, who in 1938 in the meeting of the Indian Independent Labour Party very clearly said that closest to their stand are the communists. I would also tell people that since those people who have access to intellectual resources can comprehend the history, so majority of the leaders of the Communist Party are upper caste. Now that was a wrong opinion, that was a wrong analysis. There is a book by Kanti Biswas. So not only the Indian communists not take up the case of the social justice, many of them are still not able to transcend their caste prejudices, their prejudices emanating from the biological accident of birth. So the region is not undergoing the process of unlearning. For a Marxist, theory, unity of theory and practice, the theory of praxis is one of the key concepts. Self-criticism is another key concept. Indian communists have forgotten all these Marxian concepts and they have immersed into, in fact, this was my main issue, the parliamentarianism into the Indian communist movement. But leaving that, parliamentary, Lenin and everyone has said that parliamentary elections cannot bring about revolution. The wrecking from the within, from the beginning of revisionism in the Second International in 1890s, since then Kautsky and subsequently the degenerated German social democrats, everyone for now over 150 years, they have been trying to bring about revolution through parliament. Parliamentary democracy is political expression of capitalist social relations. It cannot be transformed, as Marx says in the Paris Commune, in the Civil War in France, that state machinery, the bourgeois state machinery cannot be relied on, cannot be taken to bring about revolution. The instrument of slavery cannot be instrument of emancipation. But Indian communists, though they resolved in 1953, in 1952 they had not fought the elections. 1951, the left line, which they call left deviation, has triumphed. In 1953, the right line dominated and Communist Party of India decided to participate in the parliamentary elections as a means to propagate revolutionary ideas. But the means has become the end. How can one fight capitalism? By radicalizing the social consciousness. That is, by expansion of the class consciousness. How it can be done? In Eastern UP and many parts of India, which were the strong base of the CPI, had gone back to BJP. Because these parliamentarians never tried to convert their number power into people's power. Never tried to convert their followers, that is why with the party line. One party line took them somewhere and another party line took them away. So the members of the parliament and members of the assemblies and the governments who went there, they lost their revolutionary fervor, and at the moment there is no qualitative difference between CPI, CPM and other parliamentary parties. With this, though lots of things are left, but doesn't matter. I wish my paper circulates. With this, I again thank you all for listening to me with patience, and I again thank to Audrey organizing people for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to meet all these people who are still interested in Marxism. Marxism will never die. As long as there are class societies, the human, as Fukuyama said, that development of human thinking will end. Development of human thinking will never end. The engine of the history does not have reverse gear. Every next generation is always smarter. That is how we have reached from Stone Age to the Cyber Age. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our last paper of this session, the fourth one, is titled Marxism's Combined and Uneven Development. And that will be presented by Professor Auritro Majumder. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me from the back? Excellent. So if I'm either too loud or not very loud, please let me know. So one of the things that I was looking at as I was preparing to come to Patna was the coverage in the popular press. I don't know how many of you saw that. One persistent theme that that, say for instance, the Times of India, the Telegraph, and a bunch of other newspapers seem to be making is the fact that Marxism, of course, is over and dead, but some of the ideas of Marx could still be discussed at an academic, but not at a political level. And I want to start with that point because I think the idea of combined and uneven development is also sort of deeply rooted to this notion of datedness. And part of what I want to suggest, and if I don't get the time to talk about this in the paper, I just want to put this up at the very outset, is the idea that there's this increasing tendency to think of conceptual datedness of the past, right? That we cannot use conceptual tools of the past to analyze the present anymore. And part of what I want to suggest is that it's not that simple. That when we think of what is new, right, there are prior iterations of this new. And what we think as very dated or as very old often has some very interesting points of resonance and relevance to the present. And so with that, I begin. I'll talk about two texts from the interwar era, right? Again, both from the past. One is Emin Roy's India in Transition in 1922, which Prasanta talked about a little bit. And the other is Mao Zedong's Yan'an lectures on literature and art. So it has become fairly customary to locate the failures of post-colonial nationalism in the Third World Project of Asian, African, and Latin American nation-states. Such accounts typically decry the failures of the post-colonial nation-state by identifying the Third World with nationalism and discounting the aspect of communist internationalism by limiting the latter to the Soviet-led communist Eastern Bloc. And Ijaz Ahmed talks about this a good deal. As such, paradigms of post-colonial studies have had little to no conceptual room for accommodating communist discourse in the so-called Third World. Post-colonial scholarship's engagement with the 20th century Marxian problematic is rare, and even then, ideologically misplaced. Sanjay Seth, just to take one example, argues, for instance, that the influence of the Comintern on Marxist politics in India produced a convergence between Indian nationalism and the Indian left. Such a view does not account for the widespread fissures and tensions within anti-colonial nationalism in spaces such as India, nor does it account for the starkly anti-Soviet attitudes of significant sections of the Marxist left that turned to China, Cuba, Congo, Vietnam, and other examples in the middle of the Cold War. Drawing on the figure of Madhavendranath Roy, I suggest, by contrast, that anti-colonial internationalism originated in and drew sustenance from a much more complicated relationship between Marxism and anti-colonial thought. The intersection of anti-colonialism and Marxism in the interwar era, 1918 to 1939, forms a key node in the development of transnational imaginaries in the post-colonial world of the 1960s. So M.N. Roy occupies a somewhat unique position in the history of anti-colonial thought, having participated in 4 major movements of his time: the Mexican, the Soviet, the Chinese, and the Indian revolutions. He was founding member of 2 of the world's first communist parties in Mexico and India, gained prominence with Lenin's patronage as a major ideologue in the Comintern in the 1920s, was excoriated by Trotsky as a Stalinist lackey, and was expelled from the Stalinist Comintern as a fascist collaborator. His biographer Somoren Roy proclaims, quote, that Roy differed from all those before him in holding that revolution in the colonies would liberate the proletarians in the metropolitan countries, unquote. He was tailed at one time by British intelligence in India as the most dangerous communist operative, and denounced after his expulsion from the Comintern at another time by Indian communists as an agent of British imperialism. He was a major revolutionary intellectual of his time. Presenting a supplementary thesis on national and colonial questions that challenged Lenin's position in the Second Congress of the Comintern. He served as a military commander in Bolshevik war efforts in Central Asia and authored 2 pioneering tomes on materialist analysis of India and China. These are respectively India in Transition, which came out in 1922, and Revolution and Counter-Revolution in China, that was published in 1930. He was a polyglot and peripatetic global revolutionary, and recent scholarship has sought to reclaim him as, quote, an anti-colonial thinker of tremendous clout, unquote, ranking alongside Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi, and others. So Roy's political project to place anti-colonial national liberation at the heart of the project of anti-capitalist world revolution, nevertheless, finds its most succinct expression in what is one of his most significant theoretical works, India in Transition. His attempt to guide Comintern policy was complemented by his politico-theoretical work on the colonial questions, where he emphatically delineated an expansive materialist framework for the distinctive social and economic characteristics of the colonial periphery. Written in the Soviet Union as a direct outcome of the Comintern's deliberations and published in 1922 and translated into several languages immediately, India in Transition attempts a materialist exploration of contemporary British India. The text's pioneering theoretical contribution lies in illustrating the uneven forms of colonial capitalist development in India under British rule, and arguing for the incommensurability of political interests of India's landed and industrial elite on one hand and the working class and peasantry on the other. India in Transition's analysis of colonial capitalist unevenness is shaped by a variety of intellectual dialogues, all of which came to structure Roy's personal trajectory as well. These include Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Leo Trotsky's law of uneven and combined development, the Latin American Marxist Jose Carlos Maria Tegui's analysis of semi-colonial, semi-feudal Peruvian society, which would be taken up in a different vein by Mao Zedong in China, and the Indian nationalist Dadabhai Nauroji's drain theory of poverty. These influences provide Roy with a methodological tool of dialectical analysis, what he calls the searchlight of historical materialism. If Roy's earlier career marked a move from cultural nationalism to Marxist internationalism, which is briefly, the period after he leaves India in 1915, all the way to his visit to the Soviet Union in 1920, India in Transition, which is published just a few years after that, marks a reverse trajectory, where Roy reorients Marxist theory to account for the distinctive forces of emancipation in the struggles of his natal land. India in Transition self-consciously highlights at the very outset the unreliability of the archive for the purposes of such a radical intellectual project. The opening illuminates Roy's materialist awareness of the complicity of knowledge with colonial power. Anticipating a later generation of post-structuralism influenced subaltern historians, Roy notes that, quote, "We are obliged to learn about the past of the Indian people from two sources, namely the imperial historians, who write more about the civilizing mission of their illustrious countrymen than about the life and conditions of the conquered people, and Indian authors, who are very apt to sacrifice historical facts at the altar of patriotism," unquote. The archive, therefore, provides, quote, "little information as to the economic condition of the toiling masses," unquote. Roy's text seeks to account for colonial difference by reading the specificity of India's socio-economic conditions in the light of an expanded and reconfigured Marxist framework. His discussion of caste provides a significant instance. Recalling his earlier awareness of the politics of race in the US, which he visited briefly for a year in 1919, and how this in turn affected the construction of Indian nationalist identity, Roy takes issue with schools of Indian nationalist historiography, which held that caste hierarchies result from the uniqueness of Indian civilization, and that, quote, "Indian culture has been a unique thing," unquote. In a reference to Gandhism, Roy notes that such culturalist approaches preach that class struggle is a peculiar outcome of the West and is not possible in Indian society. And again, this is a criticism that sort of has plagued Marxism in India for decades, and it keeps coming back and back. In sharp contrast, Roy's exploration of the economic basis of caste shows that, quote, "coming down to the origin of it, one discovers slavery," unquote. This is not a mechanical analysis that crudely reduces social phenomenon to economics. Rather, the economic function of caste hierarchy is complicated by, quote, "the distinction made by color," unquote. Recalling his earlier discussion of Aryanism, Roy notes that the caste line was first between the Aryan conquerors and the conquered aborigines. The distinction was made by color, the conqueror being fair and the conquered dark, unquote. Again, caste did not rest simply on such foundational narratives of origin, as Roy illustrates the manifestations of caste in diverse social formations. Thus, a social formation of the village community that relied on the hereditary division of labor stereotyped into the caste system, and caste-based guilds similar to the trade and manufacture guilds in Europe. He observes, quote, "caste was a basis of socio-economic organized production. The class line ran through the caste line," unquote. Roy's most striking observation in his explanation of the persistence of such pre-capitalist social forms of caste within colonial capitalist modernity is this, quote, Since the capitalist exploitation was carried on by a foreign imperialist bourgeoisie, the outward effects of the capitalist mode of production were not clearly felt on the Indian society, unquote. He notes afterwards that the fundamental social transformations that result from the capitalist control of the national economy have already taken place. The paradox, therefore, of colonial capitalist expansion is that on one hand, it causes fundamental social transformations, but on the other hand, these changes occur unevenly without clear markers or without causing, quote, serious disequilibrium on the surface, unquote. Roy's explanation of colonized social formations in conversation with the work of Lenin, Trotsky, Mariátegui, and Nauroji, articulates an early version, I would like to suggest, of what we recognize today as the dependency school of Latin American social theory. He notes, quote, the forcible export of more than 70% of the accumulated wealth of India by the East India Company and the deliberate destruction of the craft industries and consequent forcing of the artisan classes back to the land, unquote, were factors which prevented the growth of industrial capitalism and the development of native classes of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in colonial India. The economic incursion of capitalist exploitation created a distinctive... Is this better? Thank you. So the economic incursion of capitalist exploitation created a distinctive social situation in the colony as compared to the metropole. Right? And this is where he's branching out from canonical Marxist theory as we understand it. Quote, the Indian artisans, after having lost their independent means of production, were not absorbed into large industrial centers. In India, the social expression of machine production did not take the form of a city proletariat, but that of a vast mass of land workers and pauperized peasantry, unquote. This is different from the well-trodden path of the peasantry's expropriation from the land to be absorbed into the urban proletariat, one that Marx, for instance, observed in the case of England. The task of proletarian politics in the colony, in the face of the relative insignificance of the city proletariat, involved a redefinition of the proletariat as well. Once again, the specifics of Roy's formulation are interesting to note. The significance of this task is made evident in the section titles of the text. After an opening section on the growth of the bourgeoisie, or more precisely the lack thereof in colonial India, the following section dialectically relates it to its logical implication. The next section is titled The Condition of the Rural Population. This is followed up by 3 sections which comprise the bulk of the text, titled The Proletariat 1, 2, and 3, exploring and illuminating a historically specific Marxist analysis of colonial underdevelopment. The large masses of land workers and pauperized peasantry, numerically the most significant and economically dispossessed among the colonized populace, are key to Roy's vision of anti-colonial liberation. He calls them a floating population, and the non-traditional relation to capitalist commodity production is described as, quote, the social production and economic life of India today are inseparably woven with the structure of world capitalism. The agricultural industry in India is an adjunct of the British industrial system, and for this reason, 72% of our population engaged in the cultivation of the earth to all interests and purposes occupy the social position of proletariat in the wide scheme of capitalist exploitation, unquote. This agricultural proletariat is different from the traditional proletariat in that while both are antagonistically placed against the structure of world capitalism, the agricultural workers are doubly antagonistic to the native landowning classes as well. As Roy argued in the Comintern, proletarian internationalism in the colony is not identical to the nationalism of the elite. Roy's emphasis on the key role of the agricultural proletariat thus precedes the better-known positions of Mao Zedong and Frantz Fanon, radical theorists of the Third World peasantry. Roy's anti-colonial internationalist vision sought to chart an alternative trajectory from Eurocentric Marxian universalism, as well as anti-colonial cultural nationalism. Excuse me. His attention to questions of race and caste, as well as the articulation of a colonized floating population that is partially absorbed either among the land workers or the city proletariat, sought to move away from notions of a so-called Western proletarian class. Equally, his rejection of cultural nationalism, particularly the thought of Gandhi, placed national liberation struggle in a broader framework. Gandhi and the national bourgeoisie's staunch suspicion of political action of industrial and agricultural workers drew the most severe condemnation from Roy. As he notes in his memoirs, which is a separate text published much later in the 1950s, such a position put Roy in disagreement, a crucial point of difference with Lenin at the Comintern, who viewed Gandhi as a revolutionary. Again, in a 1924 article, sardonically titled Mahatma and Bolshevism, Roy scathingly observed that Bolshevism, quote, forged ahead, breaking one link after another in the mighty chain of time-honored servitude, while Gandhism gropes in the dark, spinning out ethical and religious dogmas, unquote. Situated nearly 3 decades before Indian independence, Roy's project thus made him a visionary much ahead of his time. And so the second text that I want to discuss is Mao Zedong's 1942 Yan'an Forum talks on literature and art. Delivered during the height of the Chinese liberation campaign against the Japanese, and thus marking the end of a certain historical sequence of the interwar era. The Yan'an lectures are a milestone in articulating the relationship between proletarian art and nationalist cultural tradition. Between M.N. Roy and Mao, to put it modestly, we witness the consolidation of an Asian notion of the East, with a remarkable emphasis on the idea of culture as a site of emancipatory practice. The Hegelian Marxist categories of dialectical philosophy, previously restricted to elegant explanations of bourgeois Europe, encounters and has to grapple with a new, foreign, and properly world historical object of study. Non-European societies, such as those in Latin America, Asia, and to some extent Africa, come to take center stage during this period, eclipsing and thoroughly reconfiguring the European conception of the world. Mao, like M.N. Roy, were of course addressing distinct notions of the proletariat as befitting the different socio-historical locations. Both, however, commonly understood the term to be referring to those who, by virtue of their self-activity, were singularly responsible for the reproduction and perpetuation of society, without necessarily having attained the consciousness of doing so. The dialectic between speculative thought and social being, and between transcendence and actualization, posed a properly universal or ex-European problematic only in the 20th century, shared alike by socialist thinkers in Europe and anti-colonial intellectuals in Asia. At the same time, in the figure of Mao, there emerges a new trajectory and an astute reformulation of the relation of speculation to totality, one that is rooted in the specifics of 20th century anti-colonial struggle, and especially over definitions of the people. And But before we get into Mao's conception of the people, I also want to touch very briefly on the ideas of an 18th century Italian thinker by the name of Giambattista Vico. So in the New Science, which is Vico's major tome, he observes in a very well-known passage on method that in order to trace the development of human thinking, and I'll just read out a small quote from the text, that with the philosophers, we must fetch it from the frogs of Epicurus, from the cicadas of Hobbes, from the simpletons of Grotius, from the men cast into this world without care or aid of God. Our treatment of it must start from the time that these creatures begin to think humanly. We have to descend from these human and refined natures of ours to quite wild and savage natures, unquote. This is from Giambattista Vico's The New Science. Vico seems to have been aware of the highly uneven aspect of popular consciousness, fueled no doubt by the Neapolitan philosophers' understanding of 18th century Italian city-states and their competing claims to sovereignty. This problematic of unevenness, what he terms the national component, right, of the spirit, is taken up nearly a century later by Hegel in his lectures on the philosophy of world history, as many of you know, and even later in the 20th century by Vico's compatriot Antonio Gramsci. On the other hand, Mao, who takes up a similar thematic in his Yan'an talks, is responding to his contemporaries in the May 4th movement, to the debate between the westernizers and the neo-traditionalists of various stripes, as much as to the European Enlightenment. In the Yan'an lectures, the methodological point that Mao makes about intellectual work is remarkably resonant with Vico's advice to the philosophers, namely, that one has to make sense of creative imagination, what Vico terms divinity. To divine in secular fashion is to imagine from the material conditions in which the people operate. It is wrong, Mao holds, for intellectuals to look at the culture of the past and to deduce from them the character of the people. Such an approach mistakes forms, which are but ideal projections, and substitutes them for actual social relationships. And Mao takes two seemingly antithetical positions at once. On one hand, intellectuals have to engage critically, he says, with, quote, the hangover of petty bourgeois ideology among many proletarians and backward ideas, unquote. On the other hand, he asserts that many intellectuals were, quote, acquainted neither with their subjects nor with their public, unquote. If the former suggests a vanguardist notion of consciousness raising from above, at the same time, much of what Mao says about the intellectual's lack of familiarity undercuts and in many ways fundamentally alters the previous position to propose a different vision of literature and art. Just as Vico had quixotically proposed moving from Epicurus, Hobbes, and Grotius to undertake a study of the frogs, the cicadas, the stones, and rocks in order to illuminate the savage natures of the early humans, so too does Mao. Impatient with what he calls abstract ideas, Mao claims, quote, in the life of the people there lies a mine of raw material for art and literature, unquote. A fairly commonplace suggestion that. But what is distinctive is Mao's twofold insistence that the life of the people be understood first and foremost through things traditionally considered by intellectuals to be dirty and crude. A second aspect, following from this previous one, is a call for a historical materialist philological inquiry, that language itself be investigated afresh. Right? And I would also like you to ponder over this fact that when Emin Roy talks about the archive, he's talking about a very similar problematic of language, that how does one recover from the language of the past the voices of those at the margins and at the lower end of spectrum of society. So Mao places, almost done, yeah, 3 minutes is good. So Mao places language and philological inquiry at the very heart of the objective study of human society. He emphasizes that language is key both to the development of inner psychic life as well as to cultural expression. The latter includes oral and plastic art in addition to written texts of literature. Language not only registers but also dialectically determines human proletarian existence, including people's emotions, their manners, as well as wall newspapers, murals, folk songs, and folk tales. Changing patterns of human interaction with the material world and the historical evolution of modes of living are traced in the field of language. Language, then, is a dynamic, constantly changing index of historical human experience. It needs to be pointed out that such a conception of language runs counter to the linguistic approach canonized in theory post-Saussure, where language is held to be a closed rather than open system, with no grounding in history. In fact, the very category of history as something that is material and human-made disappears in the post-structuralist redefinition of language. Mao's interlocutor in post-war France, the anti-humanist philosopher Louis Althusser, perhaps best exemplifies this paradoxical trend. On the other hand, the Yan'an lectures have been criticized with good reason for propagating a partisan party line view of artistic production. Such criticisms are well known and need not concern us here. But for his part, Mao refutes the orthodox conflation between politics and art, and in fact devotes the entire last 2 sections of the lectures to make the point that political and aesthetic criteria are differently based, not the same thing, and should not be substituted for each other. In short, artists and intellectuals enjoy a degree of autonomy separate from political activism. Their concerns are also somewhat distinct from the prevailing milieu. A significant number of statements and passages from the lectures could be cited to support this view. What is more important, however, is his view of past traditions of national cultural forms. And so I'll just, in the minute or so that's left, I'll quickly summarize what I mean by the last sentence, Mao's view on national culture. So if Vico in the New Science had presented the past as something that is truly comprehensible only to those who lived it, and therefore foreign to the present, Mao takes the Vickian position further. Echoing Vico, Mao argues that national character is historically uneven at any given point, including the present. Depending on levels of human self-actualization, different historical epochs coexist within the same nation. Such unevenness further implies that cultural forms belonging, strictly speaking, to different historical eras are to be found coexisting with one another in the present moment. Mao proposes what is undoubtedly an extension of Vickian philological project, namely, quote, the use of the artistic and literary forms of the past and imbuing, quote, reshaping them and filling them with new content, unquote. He argues that the socialist intellectual cannot be blind to the past like the modernizers, nor to the outside world like the nativists. The correct approach, he says, is immanent and relational, quote, not rejecting the legacy of the ancients and the foreigners, even though it is feudal or bourgeois, unquote, but combining these with our own creative work. Arguably, this is a theory of world literature, where both the past and the non-national as foreign forms interact and intersect with the form and content of the local and immediate present. It is So just to conclude, so Mao's Yan'an lectures on literature and art have a long institutional and cultural life that is not limited to China alone. What stands out in this process of global circulation is the notion of humanist transformation. If Maoism, quote, and I place this term within quotation marks because of course it means something very different depending on who you speak to. If Maoism found a captive, albeit ill-informed audience in the new left circles of the West in the 1960s and 70s, as well as among activists of the Third World, part of that appeal surely lay in the philosophical affirmation of the figure of the human. In this mode, the European intellectual tradition founded by Vico and Hegel paradoxically found its way back to the West through Mao and Emin Roy's Asian dialectics. This occurred too, it has to be said, in the face of the despair of much of post-war Western, especially French, anti-humanist theory. On the other hand, what is elided in the Western reception of Mao is the enormous impact that his formulations, especially on popular sovereignty and so on, had on African and Latin American struggles in the era of the Cold War. And in the second half of the 20th century, I want to say, no other Asian figure, including M.K. Gandhi, exercised comparable influence in the non-European world. So I would just like to end on that note, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Fine papers. It's been a feast, certainly, right, in anticipation of dinner. But between now and then, we have an occasion to raise questions. So I think we might take them in blocks, maybe 4 or 5 questions, then allow the panelists to answer those questions, and then if we have, as time permits, that we'll open it up to additional ones. And I'd ask you to address your comments and your questions to the particular colleague in question to whom you'd like to address your question. Thank you. And if you could wait, please, for the microphone so we can all hear you.
To the first and the last speakers, both very good papers. I think somehow there is a missing element here, which is not to be sort of sectarian, but there's a Trotskyist thought in South Asia. Trotskyism was very important in Sri Lanka, and it was not an unimportant bit in India. The man A.R. Desai and his writing on nationalism became very popular. So at some stage when you've done all this, you should direct your mind to finding out where the archives of Indian and South Asian Trotskyism is, because it is an important problem. I was sort of puzzled that you were so uncritical about Mao's humanism compared to what he did to his own country. When he finally got to power, he forgot all the nice things he said about autonomy of artists and the human and all that. And really one has to say, even in one sentence, that he did cause a famine of 40 million people died. And that is not a small matter.
Who's next?
I have 2 questions, one to Edoardo and one to Auritro. So to Edoardo, I am a little disturbed by this discussion on feminism as if it is homogeneous, because feminists themselves have argued that feminism is contested and there are multiple feminisms. So how do you react to that, especially in the context of the fact that while you draw on Marx and Engels, family, private property and the state, but there is no mention of the works of Bebel, of Rosa Luxemburg, of Clara Zetkin, of Alexandra Kollontai, just to name a few, in terms of a corpus of work that establishes the tenets of what we understand as Marxist feminism. So how would you respond to that? To Auritro, I have a sort of a footnote, which is that when you discuss Emenroy's writing on the proletariat, and especially the agrarian workers, you in some way seem to be arguing that it is a departure from Marx, because in Marx somehow there is this idea that the displaced from the, for the people who are displaced.
Okay, please.
Yeah, my name is Michael Brie from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Germany. I have a question to Edoardo. I liked your presentation. I'm coming from the GDR, so I know what you have spoken about. I'm just wondering about one problem we are discussing in our foundation very often. This is the relation, as you mentioned, of class, gender, race, and so on. Often this is dealt and used the concept of intersectionality. Yeah, so, but this again, this concept is not very productive. Yeah, it makes clear that there is no main contradiction. I totally agree with this. But the problem for real struggles, let's say in Germany, around the refugee problem, around the uprising of the new right forces, yeah, we see that by the markets and by the global markets and by the competition enforced on the labor force, class is splitted. Class is splitted. And the gender relations are enforcing, of course, the class split, and vice versa. As feminists are splitted, of course. Yeah? Because the possibility to uprise or to keep position in the current societies depends to a high degree on your ability to keep on the market, on the labor market. This is, I think, the crucial. And citizenship, age, gender, race, all are influencing your ability or inability to keep on the labor market. So, and we are discussing the problem of new class politics with regard to this, how we can bring in a solidarity way together different groups, not going back to the old idea of the main contradiction and also not just to say all contradictions are somehow equal, which is somehow true, but it's not workable. What it means for a real transformative strategy to deal with these contradictions. Thank you.
We thank you. Perhaps one more question in this first round.
Yep. Is this working? Yeah. First to Prasanta, just very briefly, almost factually, but the stakes around the publication of Marx's writings on India and the way that they're being transmitted to Indians in Britain. So you have the Bedis, you have Baba Pyarelal Bedi and Freda Bedi publishing Marx on India, doing independent research. But crucially, you have Ralph Fox going to the Soviet Union, going to the Marx Engels Institute, working with a complete file of the New York Tribune, coming back with those writings, and they don't see the light of day for years. And when they finally do get published by Mokraj Anand, who's of course not a member of the Communist Party, very strangely, Rajnipal Dutt comes out with a new edition a few years later. And so I'm wondering if there is any debate within the Communist Party as far as you can see, because certainly Ralph Fox was questioned seriously about his writings on Lenin by the party in Britain around, in a sense, the salutariness or desirability of publishing Marx on India and what the rationality might have been and whether that had anything to do with the actual reception in India. To Auritro, I fear that you make a virtue of defeat in the way that you talk about overcoming Eurocentrism without talking about the defeat of communist revolution in Europe as fundamentally conditioning the way that Emin Roy and Mao then have to respond politically. Instead, you talk about the 20th century as this triumphant transformation of an overcoming of Eurocentrism without talking about Marxism's self-defeat in Europe as a crucial conditioning factor for the long-term trajectory of the Soviet Union, which itself then, of course, is strongly influential in the course of not only the leadership struggles in China, but the development of revolution there. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll just answer these 5, and then we'll do another round, and I acknowledged on this side that you were in queue for that right away. Perhaps we could address the questions, answer them in the order that they came. So the first one was from Lord Desai, and he had a question for you, I believe, Dr. Majumder. Oh, yes. Good.
Yes, to just quickly answer the 3 questions in order. I think the question that Lord Desai posed is absolutely accurate. The history of Trotskyist movements in South Asia is under-researched. I mean, Ceylon gets...
Can you put the mic really close to your mouth?
Is this okay? So Ceylon, at least gets some acknowledgement, but I also believe that there's some work that's being done on India and Pakistan, right? Especially the decade of the late 30s, early 40s, which is really the time when Trotskyism sort of posits an alternative to the CPI. To go back to the other point that you raised about humanism, I mean, that's absolutely, something that there's no disagreement on. It's not to sort of justify mass murder or any of the other atrocities. But I would also like to make a distinction between humanism as, the love of humanity, I mean, loosely understood, and humanism as a philosophical sort of tradition which insists that the world can be changed by human agency and human agency alone, right? Rather than it being the financial crisis or ecological disaster and so on and so forth. So when I refer to Mao as a humanist, I refer to it in the second philosophical sense. And so that is pretty much it. To answer the question about the agricultural workers, the lady at the back asked it. I don't think that Marx, I mean, of course, Marx is central to Emin Roy, but the person that he is responding to more than anything else, I think, is Lenin. And that also sort of ties to the question that Spencer asked, which is the defeat of European revolutions. And I think that part of what is unique about Marxism in the 20th century is, as Gramsci says, 1917, Bolshevik revolution is a revolution against Marx's capital, right? And whether we like it or not, but actually existing Marxism in the 20th century has had to engage with the consequences of that development. And we all wish that we could have, rewritten our histories and, given the revolution to our favorite countries and so on and continents, but that is not how history works, right? And so I don't necessarily think of that possibility, the possibility that dialectical philosophy has to answer and has to respond to an entirely new situation. I don't think that's entirely bad, right? In fact, I would say that it's incredibly relevant because it's precisely the sort of question that we would face today, right? Where there's no possibility of social transformation in the way that Marx would describe it. How does dialectics and dialectical philosophy respond. Right? And again, I think it's a carryover from some of the questions that we faced during the interwar era. But I'll pass on the mic to my other panelists.
Good, and I believe that that was part 2 of the second question, and the first part of the second question had to do with feminism, and I believe that that was for Dr. Schinco.
Yeah, thank you for the question at first. And so, yes, I don't have a natural answer to that in the sense that, is it true that to a certain extent I generalize what feminism is and what feminism has been in the history? But it is true, but the idea was to provide a schematization at first due to the time available for this session, so I couldn't expose the whole history of feminism. And then because it was a kind of partial and biased, if you want, narration, but it was a narration prepared in order to stress some important theoretical and practical points, and especially failures of the classic version of Marxism. And I think it's worth underlining that, because especially I'm thinking about European reality now. In order to react to neoliberal attack and then to the rise of far-wing parties in parliament, we are trying to, it seems that many people, many left activists, are trying just to use an old-fashioned and outdated model of Marxism and how to organize a party, how to put together people in order to have a common fight and stuff like that. And I don't think it can be useful. We should understand what was our failure, what were our failure, and then try to move on.
Great, and perhaps that's a segue into our colleagues from the DDR. Your question about intersectionality, that question was intended for you, wasn't it? Yeah, okay, please.
Yeah, that was a huge question in the sense that it arose so many issues, so I cannot answer to everything, but yeah, I will try just to give a general answer that is, at first, yes, I think that intersectionality is a very useful category, but not in the contemporary feminism. That is, I think we should develop a Marxist feminism, because I think that contemporary feminism is pretty confused from the philosophical point of view. That is, you have the influence of Michel Foucault, so you have a kind of post-structuralist version, so they are kind of relativists and so on. But at the same time, other feminists in the same group are trying to use human rights in order to justify their criticism, their fair and right criticism against government. So, of course, you cannot put human rights and Foucault together because it makes no sense. Instead, and the other thing is that two things, to be sincere. That is, the first thing is that they criticize universalism too much, and it seems that now they are just splitting apart group and group over and over again. So I think we should prepare a new version of universalism, and I don't have idea how to, a precise idea how to devise this kind of universalism in order to, at the same time, recognize the minorities' interests and needs, but and then not to fall into a relativistic point of view. And the other thing is that sometimes it seems they are maybe just like a reaction. They are stressing too much gender, law, and gender, sex, and race as factor, and not enough class. And so, for example, if I'm thinking about there is this current discussion in Europe that is after the 1968 we have a progressive decline of paternal laws, paternal authority, and so on. And I think we cannot understand entirely this decline of paternal law if you don't understand that there has been a feminization of workforce. So, of course, the father is no longer the only breadwinner, and of course, if the structure change, the superstructure will change as well. It's not an answer for everything you ask. But.
Good. And the last question, fifth question, Dr. Leonard, is it okay? You've been answered adequately? Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes, and rather than remarks, it seems valuable, I think, for a, or I'm told 7:45 we've been allowed. Is this true? Is this okay? Okay. And so maybe rather than my remarks, we can just take one more round of questions. So if we could start over here, please.
Before I raise just a very brief point to two of the speakers, quick word of but capital letter thanks to Shahbal and Adri, because organizing this itself is a great feat, not only in terms of logistical arrangements, but it's about vision. And I suggest that towards the end, perhaps we can do a little bit of research in these 3 days to find out what's happening all over the world on this bicentenary. And I'm sure Shahbal's, or this event must be one of the unique ones, and therefore he should deserve a special thanks again towards the valedictory function. Having said this, I come back to my brief question, and first to my friend from JNU, Professor East Mishra. And I mean, even if your prelude was initially 1200s and went on to 17,000 words, and that was very interesting, a very good talk, and I remember we all got reminded of those passionate discussions in JNU days. However, I just want to raise this point that do you seriously, analytically still hold to this idea that, and as you said, one of the biggest critique of the Indian communist movement is that you said, well, they thought the parliamentary route will be to the revolutionary consciousness, etc. That's absurd, and parliamentary route will never lead to that revolution. But then do you really believe that a revolution still is possible of the kind that happened on those times in Russia and in China? And why I'm saying this is that I'm referring to Theda Skocpol's work, The Comparative Study of the Revolution of France, Russia and China. A great historical institutionalist of Harvard who argued very painstakingly historical research to suggest that the revolutions in France and China and others, where somewhere it failed and somewhere it did not, was also the product of the structural conditions of that time, which included among inter alia many factors, huge historical situation of state incapacity to counter the revolutionary movements. Those conditions are not possible to be replicated when the state has got enormous power, military and others, which was not available at the time. And therefore the onslaught of the international war led to the incapacity of state in China, which also helped Mao and its revolutionary forces to make a winning attack. So those conditions do not perhaps structurally are available, and historical materialist institutionalists argue that those conditions may not be replicated and hence a revolution may not be possible, even if it is desirable. So that's one issue that I want to raise. And quickly to the first author, I think Professor Dhar, and that is that, very interesting details about those times of how these ideas came, in what ways, what publications and what was seized and how they finally led to all that. And there was this mention about this very fascinating, stimulating analytical categories. Ideas propagate through association. Association has an infrastructural intermediation. What is hidden in infrastructure? That is, about those ideological linkages. That there is also a cognitive linkage. I, however, with due respect, could not see the link between the detailed empiricism, empirical details, and these analytical constructs. How did they translate into, how these ideas at some time of historical epoch proliferated? What was happening analytically, if you can draw out, what was happening that it allowed the proliferation sometime and then led to decay? what was those cognitive linkages which once worked to allow that proliferation and somehow, led to a decay later. That analytical learnings and linkages, which should be linked to the empirical details, perhaps was not there. So if you could like to enlighten on that. Thank you.
I believe in the interest of time, that should be our last question. It's a two-part question, and maybe we could start with the second part first, which was directed to Dr. Dhar. Yeah? And then the final word can be left to you, Professor Mishra, to answer the question. Yeah?
Yes.
Let's answer this one first, and then you can answer. You'll answer the first part of it. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. I mean, I could only end with the anecdote why this circulation was happening at all. This is the moment of, 1937, the first provincial governments are being formed, and within few years, 1942, everybody is sure that something is going to happen. 1946, everybody is sure that British are going out. So India is getting independent. That moment is building up through this decade, 1936 to 46. What is happening in Kolkata is the question of the intellectuals and mediations, and the question of Indian Renaissance. This is a question that started in 1907, 1908, at the moment of Swadeshi. What is Swadeshi? What is India? What is the cultural identity of India? And Emin Roy is answering. He is establishing institute like Indian Renaissance Institute. He is running the journal, The Marxian Way. Every issue has something on Indian Renaissance, largely European Renaissance and whatnot. And what Sushobhan Sarkar is doing in his 1946 notes on the Bengal Renaissance is a critique of Emin Roy, right? So the problem there is, what is the value of colonialism in India? And if it is of some value, then what happened in 19th century when British rule started, administration started in India, what we know, what this later nationalists have claimed to be the Bengal Renaissance, starting with Ram Mohan Roy and so forth, that rationalist strain, that could not have come to India without the coming of British rule and English education, and of course rationalist philosophy and Hume and whatnot. So what is the value of that? That is the big debate that is going on here. Re-evaluation of 19th century culture, of rationalism in India, re-evaluation of Tagore himself. So Spencer, thank you for bringing in Ralph Fox. It's also Caldwell being read big time, and through Caldwell, one of the very young Marxists in Kolkata, he takes on his entire reading of reality, illusion and reality from Caldwell, very wrongly onto Rabindranath Tagore, saying that he is a bourgeois nationalist. I mean, a few years later, Sushobhan Sarkar comes back. It's the year of Rabindranath's death, 1941. Sushobhan Sarkar comes to kind of trying to rescue that. So that debate is going on. It's the question of literary modernity. Modernity in Bengali literature. What is modernity? What is the place of Rabindranath Tagore? What is the place of post-Tagore poets? How they define their distance? Are they modern? If Tagore is modern, what is their role? That is the larger debate on culture that is going on. And Marxism is being read by this limited, English-educated and very well established figures in Kolkata at that point of time. They are debating within themselves, also beyond themselves. These are the ideological associations that is happening there. Professor Desai is not here, but the point on Trotsky, there was one Trotskyite in India at this point of time named Somendranath Tagore. He was thoroughly in this Ram Mohanite rationalist way, and he translated the manifesto as a manifesto of the bearer of right. So that's the righted discourse, that's the rationalist discourse. That is happening with Trotsky in Kolkata at that point of time. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
And I believe the last word has to go to Professor Mishra, but very short, please. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I will answer it. Yes, revolution is always possible. And it's not that it will come. Revolution has to be brought out with the conscious human effort, with the level of consciousness, with the level. Rousseau said that revolution is a continuous process. Continuously bombard the Bastille. Marx and Engels and Mao's famous statement that revolution is continuous process until it reaches its logical conclusion. I feel my analysis of the communist movement world over is that existing communist parties of the world have become irrelevant. They are waning away. Now, one phase of revolution began with the 1789 French Revolution, the continuous phases of revolution and counter-revolution. Buddhist revolution stayed for longest. It was again followed by Brahmanical counter-revolution, Ramayana and Gita, and all those are philosophical justification of the Brahmanical counter-revolution. Russian Revolution has been the first. 1971 Paris Commune was the model of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels both pointed out. Elected commune, magistrates working on the workman's wages. Though commune lasted for only 2 months, all the reactionary forces of the Europe, the traditional enemies, Germany and France, united to crush the commune. That is what I say. Tomorrow, if there is a workers' revolution in India or in China, Pakistan, India will forget about their eternal enmity and join hands to crush the revolutionary movements. So, it is a continuous process, and now I hope that next wave, one wave is over. About 20th century revolution with one particular way, as I said, that rest revolutions did not take it as a method, but took it as a model. All the communist parties have the same structure. So, I hope, as I said, history does not have reverse gear. It can have U-turns. Present U-turn Indian history, world history has taken towards reaction is dangerous. But no U-turn is permanent. It will certainly soon take another turn, and revolution is not only desirable but possible also, as was proved by Rousseau, Marx, Engels, Mao and Lenin. One phase of revolution is over. One phase, it does not. The Russian Revolution made, as John Reed says that, 10 days that shook the world. It absolutely changed the agenda of the international politics. The whole world got divided into Marxist and anti-Marxist. All the behavioralism, all these new social sciences, they are nothing new. They are different streams of liberalism to counter Marxism. As Engels has said in the burial speech that time is not away when world will be for Marx and anti-Marx, and Russian Revolution proved that after Russian Revolution, everyone is Marxist or anti-Marxist. In India, communist presence is almost marginal. Still on social media, on Facebook, you say anything, people start abusing Marx. That means that the terror of ideas, the authority wields fear, ideas wield terror. Marx के ideas का terror इतना था कि no one, he became a danger for Germany, he became a danger for France, he became a danger for Belgium. So I end with this, that revolution is possible, not only desirable, but possible. It would not come on its own, it has to be brought about by class-conscious working class.
Excuse me. So that was an applause, but please allow me one more time or join me in thanking all four of our panelists for this last session.
I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the mementos to our speakers and our chair. We thank all the speakers for presenting their papers and Professor Jensen for chairing this session. With that, we come to the end of the first day of the conference. We saw some very interesting and stimulating lectures and papers being presented today. We'll begin tomorrow's program at 9:30 a.m. with a lecture by Professor Anjan Mukherjee. Just a couple of other announcements. Everyone staying at the Bamiti Guest House is requested to wait for the bus at the reception after dinner by 8:45 p.m. Once again, requesting all delegates to take out 5 minutes to record short videos for Adri's archives. And anyone on social media using Facebook or Twitter, we have a couple of hashtags. Hashtag Marx200 and hashtag Marx for Global Future. We now invite everyone for dinner in the adjacent hall, Kautilya Hall, and thank you everyone.